Okay, so we're going to continue our discussion about blood in biology of Science 30. And so we just spoke in the last video about the different blood vessels, so arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And so we're going to keep considering those five blood vessels, but we're going to consider what blood pressure is as well, and then see where the blood pressure changes throughout those blood vessels. So blood pressure is a measurement of the pressure that the blood is being pumped through at any given point throughout the circulatory system. Normal blood pressure in a healthy, average sized, average fitness level adult is around 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury, which is a measure of pressure. And so the top number, the 120, is what we call systolic pressure. And the bottom number is what we call diastolic pressure. And so that's partly due to that lub dub sound that you've heard when you've probably felt your pulse or heard a heartbeat, that bottom, bottom, bottom. And so the systole and the diastole are different points in the heart's valves, either opening or closing, relaxing or contracting. And so we'll break down systole and diastole and heart valves and when they open and when they close more specifically in the next video regarding um, blood flow in the heart and heart structures. But for now, I just want you to understand that normal blood pressure is a measure of a number, 120 over 80, where the top number is called the systolic pressure and the bottom number is called the diastolic pressure. And so we can measure blood pressure using a fancy blood pressure cuff. So blood pressure cuffs have a medical term called a sphygmomanometer. And so a sphygmomanometer or a blood pressure cuff or blood pressure machine is designed to wrap around the arm, the upper arm, on the bicep, and it's designed to sit very specifically on a brachial artery. So that's one of the major arteries in your bicep in your upper arm. And when you turn it on, and if you've ever gone to like Shoppers Drug Mart or a pharmacy and you've stuck your arm in one of those blood pressure machines, you would put your arm in, or in my case, when I was like 6 or like probably last week, I would try sticking my leg inside of it and then get yelled at by um, the people working there. Not something you want to do as an adult, but as a kid, I did it all the time. And so, if you stick your arm properly in the blood pressure cuff in that machine, you'll notice that it increased pressure and it put pressure right on your brachial artery. Now, the question I want to ask is why do you think that we are specifically measuring blood pressure at an artery? So, if you think about it, it makes sense. Arteries have the highest blood pressure. We talked about that in the last video. And so, we would want to take the most accurate measurement of blood pressure at the point in the body or in the circulatory system where blood pressure is the highest. Therefore, it's the easiest to detect. I don't need any crazy highly sensitive devices to measure blood pressure in a far lower blood pressured blood vessel like a vein. I can just slap my blood pressure cuff right on a big accessible artery in my arm and read blood pressure as accurately as possible. And so the cuff, once it's compressed and it's increased pressure on your brachial artery of your arm, it gradually deflates until a sound is heard. So now digital sphygmomanometers or digital blood pressure cuffs are going to listen for this sound on their own using pressure and vibrations, but you can also use a more analog version of a blood pressure cuff, which is kind of visible in this picture here, where manually the physician would use a bulb and compress the pressure on the cuff of the artery, and they would listen with a stethoscope for this change in sound. So we increase pressure on the brachial artery. Step 2, we gradually deflate the pressure until we hear a sound. The first sound you're going to hear is the systolic pressure, that top number. And that's where the ventricles, a part of the heart we'll talk about next video, that's where the ventricles start to contract. The top of the heart contracts. And then in step 4, the next step, when we don't hear that sound anymore, that's considered the diastolic pressure. And this is where the ventricles are relaxing and the ventricles start to fill inside of the heart with more blood. So we'll talk about what a ventricle is in the next video, but important that you understand that when you're using a sphygmomanometer or a blood pressure cuff, whether it's an automatic digital one or it's an analog one where you're doing everything manually, you're increasing pressure on the brachial artery, gradually reducing that pressure, and you're listening for a sound. The first sound you hear is the systolic pressure. Ventricles are contracting, pushing blood out of the heart, of the ventricle. And then when you stop hearing that particular sound, that's considered diastolic pressure, so the bottom number, and then that's considered when certain valves have shut and the ventricles in the heart start filling with blood. Okay, so if we were to consider blood pressure in different blood vessels, the blood pressure is highest always in the arteries and lowest always in the veins. And you can see that right here. I've got blood pressure. The aorta is the largest blood vessel leaving the heart. It's got 3 heads. The arteries are the arteries that leave the heart and innervate your entire body. The arterioles are gradually getting a little smaller in diameter and they're also not as rigid. The pressure still drops there. And then we get to the tissues, the organs, where we're supposed to diffuse the gases, waste, nutrients, oxygen, carbon dioxide back and forth. So the pressure takes a relatively steep decline in the capillaries. And then we just see that pressure drop even further as it goes from the entire body, has exchanged materials and gases throughout the tissues at the capillaries, and now it's making its way back up to the heart through the venules, the veins, and lastly, the large vena cava, which is the largest blood vessel entering the heart. So now we can talk about some lifestyle factors that can affect increased blood pressure. So hypertension and hypotension are cases of high blood pressure or low blood pressure. So you don't ever want to have chronic high blood pressure. Increased blood pressure can be caused by high cholesterol in your diet. This can lead to atherosclerosis, which we talked about last video. And this was where your blood vessels start to narrow and clog due to fat and cholesterol deposits. The narrower your blood vessels get, the more pressure is on the blood volume that's trying to get through them because the hole is smaller. Think of it as when you have a garden hose with a brass end and you turn it, the wider you open the end, the less pressure, but the more spray-y the water on your hose gets. And then when you narrow that nozzle on the end, it shoots at a higher pressure and a narrower shot. And so that's what's happening when you have atherosclerosis. You're narrowing the blood vessels, and that blood is moving at a much higher pressure. Caffeine increases blood pressure as well. It's a stimulant. It's getting your heart to pump faster. That's of course going to increase your blood pressure. Salty foods. If you've ever had McDonald's fries, you get thirsty. You drink more water. The more water you drink, the more blood volume you have. That's like going back to our hose example. That's like going down to the actual valve for your garden hose that's attached to the side of the house and you turning it up all the way. When you open that valve right at the house all the way, it's going to let more water through that hose and you're inevitably going to get an increased blood pressure. If I close that valve at the house till just barely almost shut, you're going to find that you don't have as much water shooting out the end of the hose. So the more blood volume you have, the more the blood pressure is. So the more salty food you eat, the more water you drink, the more water you drink, the more water is in your blood plasma, the higher your blood pressure will be. Lifestyle factors, stress. Like when you're stressed all the time, your blood pressure is higher. You are in a sort of stage of fight or flight, and you've got hormones pumping through your blood that are increasing blood pressure, ready to act or run at any point. And even in our lifestyles, when we're not actually in a fight or flight scenario, but we're constantly stressing ourselves out with our modern lifestyle, this can lead very commonly to hypertension or high blood pressure. People that are older typically also have high blood pressure because their arteries aren't as elastic anymore to handle that high pressured blood. And so as their arteries become more rigid and less stretchy, it becomes harder to pump that high blood pressure blood through their arteries. And then you can have something called vasoconstriction, When you reduce the size of your blood vessels, for example, when it's really cold outside and your arteries start to tighten up and you start getting a little red in the face, or blue in the face rather, when you're getting like frostbitten or really, really cold, um, you're vasoconstricting. Your blood vessels are getting tighter, and this is no different than you tightening that nozzle on the hose end. When you narrow the tube, the same blood has to travel through a much smaller space, and so it's going to increase in pressure. The opposite can be said for hypotension, or a decrease in blood pressure. Uh, Now, if you eat well, decreased blood pressure is actually a good thing. Now, we're not talking like major low blood pressure, but as you eat healthier and have less salt in your diet and live a more regular exercise lifestyle, you'll find that your blood pressure is going to drop. And that's good. Like, you, on average, at rest, don't want to have high blood pressure. Now, you also don't want to have major low blood pressure, because that would be classified as hypotension, and that's like a extreme in the other direction, and you don't want that either. But a good diet, less stress, regular exercise, all bring your average blood pressure down, and that is a positive thing. Now, if you're dehydrated or you've experienced major blood loss, that's going to drop your blood pressure down quite far, to the point of hypotension, which is a bad thing, because just like before, in this case, if you have less blood volume, if you have less water in your blood plasma, you don't have as much water pumping through your tubes, and so you're not going to experience a very high blood pressure in those blood vessels. You can also reduce blood pressure by widening your blood vessels. So vasodilation is the opposite of vasoconstriction. Vasodilation, you are dilating, you're opening up your blood vessels. So you're lowering the resistance that the blood has to go through those blood vessels, and so blood pressure drops because the space is bigger. So we already mentioned this, but as you get older, blood pressure goes up, and that's because our arteries, as we get older, aren't as flexible, and so um, the tube remains narrower and can't get bigger and stretch as this surge of high blood pressure through those arteries is pumped through. As well, the older you are, chances are you've had an entire lifetime of perhaps poor lifestyle, poor diet, and that's increasing your likelihood of having a narrowed blood vessel due to cholesterol buildup or fatty deposit buildup. So, a couple points to look at here before we finish. Surface area is an important thing to consider when we're talking about the blood vessels. The greatest total surface area of blood vessels is always going to be in the capillaries. And there's a very specific reason for that. You want a lot of surface area. You want the capillaries to spread out a lot. And that's because the point of the capillaries is to diffuse wastes into the blood from the tissues and diffuse nutrients and oxygen from the blood into the tissues. And so to make that transfer of wastes and gases and nutrients the most efficient, we want to increase the surface area. So you'll find that capillaries are usually described and shown as a network because they're exactly that. They're a thin, one cell layer thick network of the circulatory system right on top of the tissues of organs and muscles. And that's because you want to increase the surface area to have the most efficient transfer. Now, velocity or speed that blood travels at is always going to be fastest in those arteries. And that's because as the pressure is really high in the arteries, it's pushing that blood very quickly through those arteries. Speed is actually the slowest, though, in the capillaries. And this makes sense too. Arteries, they have a high blood pressure. We are pumping them fast. The blood is moving quite quickly due to that high blood pressure. But the blood pressure slows down significantly in capillaries. So as blood pressure slows in capillaries, we're allowing time for the diffusion of nutrients and waste across that capillary membrane in and out of those tissues. So blood flows slower through capillaries because the physical diameter of capillaries is small. And we want that speed to be much slower in capillaries so there's time for the nutrient and waste exchange. Okay, so a quick review here. Arteries, veins versus capillaries. The blood vessel walls and arteries are thick. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Think A for away. The blood pressure is the highest in your arteries. Valves are not present in arteries. They don't need valves because the pressure is always just really high. It doesn't need to worry about backflow. There is a pulse in an artery. Uh, Pulse is that thing you'll feel when the pressure is high, easily found in the arteries. Relative oxygen content is quite high, except for, as an exception here, the pulmonary arteries, the arteries that go from the heart to the lungs, and we'll describe those in more detail in the next couple of videos. Veins have relatively thinner middle ground thickness veins. They're thinner than arteries for sure, but they're thicker than capillary walls. Veins carry blood towards the heart. Their blood pressure is the lowest here. Valves have to be present in veins because we're trying to stop that backflow of blood, especially up long limbs like your legs, which work against gravity and the low blood pressure. There's no pulse really present in a vein because the blood pressure is so low. This is why you don't take someone's pulse out of a vein, you take it at an artery. This is why you don't take blood pressure out of a vein, you take it on the artery. Now, the veins are going to have a low oxygen content through the systemic body circulation, but it actually has a high oxygen content in those pulmonary veins, and that's the veins that leave the lungs and come back to the heart. And we'll describe those, like I said, for pulmonary circulation in the future videos here. Finally, capillaries have the thinnest walls. Their purpose is to exchange gases and waste in and out of blood and tissues. Blood pressure is relatively middle ground here, but the speed is slow so that we can allow time for that gas exchange. There's no valves necessary nor present in capillaries. There's no pulse present in capillaries because the pressure is very, very low in capillaries, and it needs to be low. Pressure needs to be low in the capillaries because if the pressure was high and these capillaries are so small and so fragile and they're only one cell thick, imagine pumping blood through a thin capillary at a high pressure. It would just burst those blood vessels. In fact, this is what happens when you bruise. Anytime you've bruised and it turns that welty looking blue black, it's because you've ruptured some blood vessels. You've stubbed your toe and your toenail went black. That's because you've ruptured blood vessels underneath the skin. And so these capillaries are no different. They're so thin that if you had a high blood pressure go through those capillaries, it would just burst those capillaries and you'd have internal tissue bleeding, and we don't want that. And so naturally the body has a low blood pressure in those capillaries. It also allows for nice, slow exchange of nutrients and wastes. And the capillaries have a really dependent oxygen content. At the beginning of the tissue, capillaries are high in oxygen and low in CO2, but by the time the capillaries have already exchanged their gases and wastes with that particular tissue, oxygen content in the capillary blood is now low because it's gone into the tissue, and carbon dioxide and waste content is relatively high in the capillaries because it's done the exchanging and now the blood is going to make its way back to the heart. Okay, so we're going to end there, and the next video will introduce heart and the function of the heart and structure of the heart. Thanks.